Hello and welcome to our PowerPoint module. This week we're going to talk about multivariate analysis. So we've already covered univariate analysis and bivariate analysis. This week is about multivariate analysis. We have a couple of objectives for this week. First, we're going to introduce three common types of multivariate relationships, and that is the bulk of this module. Second, we're going to introduce ways of analyzing and visualizing multivariate relationships, mainly in SPSS, right? So those are our two objectives. I expect that this module will take about an hour, maybe a little bit less, but that's what we're going to be covering for this week, these two objectives. Here are your deliverables for this week. As usual, you have your PowerPoint module due Tuesday night. You have 4 questions to respond to for the module, and we do have a little bit of a break for major assignments. So you don't have any assignments due this Friday, and you also don't have any due the Friday after. Here's your opening question. What is multivariate analysis? Most quantitative social research uses some form of multivariate analysis. Why do you think this is the case? All right, so based on your reading of the book chapter, based on your understanding so far of quantitative data analysis, answer this question on Inquire, and then once you have answered it, come back for the rest. Okay, so to give an answer to that opening question, when we talk about multivariate analysis, we're talking about analysis of the relationships between 3 or more variables at a time, okay? So just like univariate analysis was 1 variable, bivariate's 2, now we're talking about 3 or more for multivariate analysis. Here are a couple of examples of the ways in which multivariate relationships might work. And these are all looking at the relationship between 3 variables. So for example, maybe we want to know if a third variable explains the relationship between 2 variables. So maybe we do some bivariate analysis, we see that there's some correlation between 2 variables, and we think that there's some intervening variable that might explain why we see that correlation. We're going to talk about this type of multivariate relationship in the module. Perhaps we think that the value of a third variable modifies the relationship between 2 variables. This is a different type of multivariate relationship, also one that we're going to discuss in this module. And multivariate analysis is an important part of social science research. It's very uncommon for one independent variable to fully predict one dependent variable, with no further factors being involved in that relationship or correlation. We live in a complicated social world where multiple factors are influencing or corresponding with multiple outcomes. All right, so we live in a multivariate world, and that's why multivariate analysis is so important for quantitative social science research. Okay, so remember I said that we are going to look at 3 different types of multivariate relationships that we might see. I'm going to go through these 3, and we're going to explore each of these relationships more deeply in the slides that follow this one. So the first one here is a spurious relationship, and we've actually talked about this a bit in class already. This is when 2 variables are correlated, but this correlation is caused by something else, some third variable. So a spurious relationship is one that we might see statistically when we do our bivariate analysis, but it turns out that that's really a false relationship. It's caused by some other third factor. Mediation is our second type of multivariate relationship. And this is a bit different from a spurious relationship because here we're saying some third variable is explaining the relationship between 2 variables. Another way of saying this is we have a third variable that intervenes in the relationship between those 2 variables. We'll see examples of this in the module to try to better distinguish between what a spurious relationship is and what mediation is, because these are different things. And then finally, moderation is when a relationship between 2 variables holds, but only for some groups and not others, or only under certain conditions and not others. Again, we're going to see examples of this to clarify what this means and how moderation differs from mediation and a spurious relationship. All right, so the following slides are going to talk about each of these in greater detail. Let's start discussing that first multivariate relationship from the previous slide. That is a spurious relationship. To repeat, this is when two variables are correlated, but this correlation is actually caused by something else, some third variable. And that means that the correlation that we see between those two variables initially is actually a false relationship. There is no real correlation or real relationship between them. It's actually caused by something else. I think it helps for each of these types of multivariate relationships to have some examples that you can draw on to better understand what we mean by, say, a spurious relationship. So the example from the book is looking at the relationship between income and voting behavior, and then also considering age and what role age plays in that relationship between income and voting behavior. So let's say we first do a bivariate test of the relationship between income and voting behavior, and we find that having higher income is correlated with voting more conservatively, whereas having lower income is correlated with voting more liberally. And we do see this bivariate correlation with most data. We might falsely conclude, after getting that bivariate association, that income causes voting behavior in some way. More specifically, that having higher income causes someone to vote more conservatively, or having lower income causes someone to vote more liberally. However, if we were to stop here and make that conclusion, this would be problematic for a couple of reasons. First, we know that correlation does not necessarily equal causation. We talked about that last week. More specifically, there might be some third variable that's driving the relationship between income and voting behavior, thus meaning that there is no real relationship between income and voting behavior. It's just something else acting on both of these variables. So in the book example, they consider age. We expect that income is going to increase with age, right? Hopefully, with more work experience, more education, promotions, income's going to increase with age. In addition, there's evidence out there that there are age differences in voting behavior, whereby older adults on average, right, there's a lot of variation. This is not saying everybody of a certain age group votes this way, but on average, older adults tend to vote more conservatively, whereas younger adults tend to vote more liberally. Of course, that's not a perfect relationship there, but on average, we might say that. So if we consider age in our analysis, right, because age is associated with income and age is also associated with voting behavior, we might find that the correlation between income and voting behavior is actually a false one. The only reason we're seeing this correlation is because of the real relationship between age and income and the real relationship between age and voting behavior. Now, if we were to completely leave age out of our analysis and not think about it, we'd have what's called omitted variable bias, right? That's when you don't include that, say, third variable in this example in your analysis, and you end up with that spurious relationship, okay? This is one example. We can think of a lot of other spurious relationships. The one that I use commonly in class is ice cream sales and murder, right? The more ice cream that is sold per capita during, any time, more ice cream that's consumed, the higher the murder rate. Now we could think, oh, well, maybe ice cream sales cause murder, but that doesn't make any sense. In reality, the murder rate is higher over the summer. Ice cream sales are higher over the summer. So the third variable that's actually driving this is the season. Okay, so that's another example for you to use. And then there's actually one more on the next slide as well. Here's another example of a spurious relationship. And this is one that we talked about in class last week. The article that you read was called Eat Chocolate, Win Nobel Prize. The big question mark, because it doesn't really make sense that there would be a causal relationship here, right? Eating more chocolate doesn't lead to someone getting smarter and winning a Nobel Prize. I did pull a couple of quotes from this article, and we can see the ways in which, especially the second one, is a bit problematic. It's assuming that there's some causal relationship here. So the first quote says, "The higher a country's chocolate consumption, the more Nobel laureates it spawns per capita." This is saying that there is a correlation, right? It's not making a causal inference here. It's just saying that there is a correlation between chocolate consumption and Nobel laureates. Now, the second sentence is a bit problematic. It says, "To produce just one more laureate, the US would have to up its cocoa intake by a whopping 270 million pounds a year." Now, this is implying there's some causal relationship. If we all just ate more chocolate in the US, we'd have more Nobel laureates. As we discussed in class, what's really happening here is a spurious relationship. There is no causal relationship between chocolate consumption and Nobel laureates. Instead, if we think about national wealth, this is perhaps explaining the levels of chocolate consumption and also explaining the number of Nobel laureates, right? Because more wealthy countries are going to have more resources that enable people to get to that stage of winning the Nobel Prize. This is another example of a spurious relationship. Okay, so now you've got at least 3 examples that you can think of, and I hope that this clarifies what we mean by spurious relationship. Let's move on to the second type of multivariate relationship that we might see. This is mediation. So to repeat from a few slides ago, mediation is when a third variable explains the relationship between 2 variables. We might also call this an intervening variable, right? That's our third variable in this case. Let's do another example because I think that these are, again, helpful in building understanding of what mediation is and how it differs from a spurious relationship. So let's say we're looking at the relationship between income and physical health. I use this example a lot. We would assume that higher income would be correlated with better physical health. And maybe we're using a specific indicator of physical health, like life expectancy or something like that. So we see that there is this bivariate correlation between income and physical health, whereby those who are higher income have better physical health. We might be interested in explaining why we see this correlation. Is there some intervening variable that explains the relationship between income and physical health? One mediator that we might consider is having health insurance, right? And maybe having good quality health insurance on top of that. With higher income comes better health insurance, better access to healthcare overall. So perhaps we would look at health insurance, type of health insurance, quality of health insurance as our mediator here. It's explaining the relationship between income and physical health. Now this is different from a spurious relationship. Spurious means that the relationship between the 2 variables isn't real. Here, instead, we're saying that the relationship between income and physical health is a real one, but that it is explained by health insurance status. That's our intervening variable. Beyond this, I would comment that social research often will test or include multiple mediators in an analysis, not just one. So for this example, we might also consider health behaviors like diet and exercise. Maybe these are mediators of the relationship between income and physical health, because those of higher income have the resources, they're able to perhaps engage in physical activity or engage in a healthy diet in a way that somebody who's lower income might not be able to do given the environment that they're in. So we could test multiple mediators here. But again, mediation is about a third or fourth or fifth, whatever number of variables explaining the relationship between 2 variables in our analysis. This brings us to our content question for this week. I want you to briefly summarize the Evans article that I had you read called Stressing Out the Poor. Identify the key independent variable that the authors explore and also the key dependent variable. What mediators do the authors discuss? And I will say there are many mediators they discuss. I want you to just name a few that stand out. Okay, so you're taking an article that's more conceptual and you're operationalizing it, right? You're identifying those dependent, independent variables as well as any mediators that you notice. Okay, so you can pause here, answer this content question, and then come back when you're done. And finally, here's the third type of multivariate relationship that we're going to discuss this week. This is moderation. To repeat from earlier in the module, moderation is when a relationship between two variables holds true for some groups but not for others. Okay? Again, let's do an example because I think this is helpful. This is an article from, it's actually kind of old, from 1992, but I found this and thought it was a good example of moderation. Let's say we're looking at, as Cooper and colleagues did, the relationship between exposure to chronic stressors and risk of alcohol use disorder. And on top of that, we also want to look at gender differences in the association between chronic stressors and risk of alcohol use disorder. In this case, our moderator is going to be gender, and our independent variable is going to be chronic stressors. Our dependent variable is going to be alcohol use disorder. Okay, so we're saying that there is a relationship between chronic stressors and alcohol use disorders, but they found that the relationship is stronger for men than it is for women. Okay, meaning that the relationship between these two variables holds true for men and not as much for women. Okay, so this is moderation, when the relationship between two variables holds true for some groups but not for others. And you can look up that example if you would like to get a deeper sense of how moderation is working here. Okay, we do have one more example of moderation just so that you have just a few different types of examples that you can draw on when you need to. Here's another example of moderation, and this is actually coming from my own research. Okay, and this is a paper I'm still working on this, so don't publish this widely or share this with others because I do want it to get published. But I do think that this is another good example because we can actually visualize how moderation is working here using the figure. So in my research, in this particular research project, I was looking at the relationship between state-level sexism, so what I'm calling it, and that is a combination of multiple state-level measures that capture gender inequality across, say, economic conditions. So one of the measures we use is the gender pay gap, for example. We can also look at political inequality, so gender inequality in representation in state legislature. And so we created this combined score of state-level sexism. And then we were looking at how state-level sexism is related to healthcare access, or particularly barriers to accessing healthcare. So our key independent variable here is state-level sexism. Our dependent variable is barriers to healthcare access. And then our moderator in this particular paper was race and ethnicity. So we wanted to see if the relationship between state-level sexism and barriers to healthcare access differed depending on women's race and ethnicity. And we compared white women, non-Hispanic Black women, that's what NH stands for, non-Hispanic, and Hispanic women. Those are the three groups that we looked at. And we actually found that more state-level sexism was associated with more barriers to healthcare for women, but this association was stronger for non-Hispanic Black and Hispanic women compared to white women. In fact, we actually didn't see a relationship between state-level sexism and barriers to healthcare access for white women. We only saw it for non-Hispanic Black women and Hispanic women. There are many reasons why we might say this. We didn't really explore mediation, right? We didn't see to explain why we saw these differences. Instead, we were testing for moderation. We wanted to see if there were group differences by race and ethnicity among women in the relationship between state-level sexism and barriers to healthcare. Now, in the figure on the right, what you see are what we call predicted probability. So this is the probability of women experiencing barriers to healthcare access. And then across the x-axis on the bottom, you see the state level sexism scores. Not to get into too much detail about how this measure in this figure was constructed, but across the bottom you see standard deviations, right? And those are showing us how far away from the average states are for state level sexism. So states that are one standard deviation above the mean, they have more sexism relative to the average state level sexism. And then there's 2 standard deviations, 3 standard deviations. Here we have more, significantly more sexism in some states compared to the average. And then being negative for a standard deviation means there's lower state level sexism compared to the average state level score, okay? But what we see here is not much of a slope for white women. That's the solid line. And I'm realizing I didn't put a key in here, so you have no idea what these lines mean. The solid line is for white women. The solid, like the larger dashed line, was for Hispanic women, I believe. And then the small dashes are for non-Hispanic Black women, okay? So we see a slope, especially for non-Hispanic Black women, we see a steeper slope, but we don't see a slope at all for white women. In fact, it looks a little bit negative. Anyway, this is a way of graphically depicting moderation, right? We see some differences in the relationship between state-level sexism and barriers to healthcare among women, white women, Black women, and Hispanic women, okay? So this is yet another example of moderation for you to draw on if you need to. Okay, so we've gone through those 3 types of multivariate relationships: spurious relationships, mediation, and moderation. I want to give you a chance to hear this from somebody else, okay? In case hearing it explained by another person besides me is going to be helpful in distinguishing between these, okay? So some of this will be a little repetitive, but it is hearing it in a slightly different way. So I have a video for you. This is from the Khan Academy. We haven't really used videos like this before in this class. It is about tutoring statistics online. So there's a video, the link is on Inquire. It's called Mediation, Moderation, and the Third Variable Problem, which is referring to spurious relationship. Once you watch this video, using the link on Inquire, I want you to answer the following video question. In your own words, explain the 3 examples that Marian Fallon, who's the Khan Academy rep in the video, explain the 3 variables that or examples that she uses to teach mediation, moderation, and the third variable problem. Okay, so really just explain the example that you hear about in this video. This will give you a chance to work through an example with the guidance of the Khan Academy and put it into your video question response in your own words. Okay, so you can pause here, watch that video, and answer this video question. And then finally, here's your closing question. I want you to take this section on multivariate relationships and apply it to the research that you're proposing for your proposal in this course. So here's your question. How might third variables operate in your proposed research? Consider the following. Do you have any mediating or moderating variables in your proposed research? If so, what are they? Do you think you might face a third variable problem, that is a spurious relationship, in your proposed research? What third variables could produce a spurious relationship in your research? Okay, so you can pause here, answer that closing question, and then come back for the final slide. So that's it for our PowerPoint module for this week. Remember, you have no assignments due this Friday or next Friday. Your readings for next week are, once again, to revisit Bryman chapters 15 and 16. You also have a reading that's online. It's from the Research Methods Knowledge Base on hypotheses. And then you have another short reading from the American College of Physicians called A Primer on Statistical Significance and P-Values. Okay, so we're going to be talking about statistical significance and hypothesis testing next week. It's a little tricky, but we'll have plenty of time to discuss it in class, and I think the PowerPoint module will help to clarify any lingering uncertainties you have about statistical significance, p-values, hypothesis testing, all of that, okay? So that's what we have coming up next week. In the meantime, I will see you in class this Wednesday and this Friday, okay? See you in class on Wednesday.